Welcome to my channel. Here, we share inspiring stories of brave and strong people. Maybe you'll see yourself or someone you know in these stories. Thank you for watching. The warm hum of a summer evening at a gas station just outside Fayetteville, North Carolina, was shattered by the roar of 3 motorcycles. Captain Jack Mercer, freshly returned from a 15-month tour in Afghanistan, stood by his truck, unaware that trouble was about to find him. The bikers swaggered into the store, their leather vests marked with ominous patches, and began to assert their dominance. What started as loud engines and careless spills quickly escalated to taunts aimed directly at Jack. They laughed at his uniform, his service, and the flag he wore proudly on his chest. Jack said nothing, but inside, his training was alive, calculating. The bikers didn't know who they were provoking or what Jack had survived. Trouble, they were about to learn, has limits. Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey tomorrow. The hum of cicadas buzzed faintly in the late summer air, mingling with the distant rustle of pine trees on the outskirts of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Captain Jack Mercer pulled his truck into the dimly lit gas station, his eyes instinctively scanning the surroundings. The warm hues of the setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to his skin as he stepped out of the vehicle, still dressed in his military fatigues. His boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way toward the gas pump. For Jack, the scene felt almost too normal. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above the worn-out gas station sign, casting uneven shadows on the cracked asphalt. The faint smell of gasoline mixed with the earthy scent of the summer evening. He couldn't help but compare the simplicity of the moment to the chaotic landscapes of Afghanistan, where tension had been a constant companion. Here, the only tension was the mild annoyance of a sputtering gas pump and a buzzing mosquito that landed briefly on his arm. Jack's mind wandered as he filled his truck. The thought of seeing his wife, Karen, and his 6-year-old daughter, Ella, sent a flicker of warmth through his chest. He imagined Ella's face lighting up when she saw the small teddy bear he had brought back for her, tucked safely in his duffel bag. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to feel the peace of anticipation, a sensation he hadn't fully embraced in over a year. The bell above the station door jingled, pulling Jack's focus back to his surroundings. An elderly man, likely the clerk, stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag and glancing Jack's way. The clerk, wearing a faded ball cap with a Vietnam veteran patch sewn onto it, offered a nod of acknowledgement. Jack returned the gesture, recognizing a kindred spirit without needing words. It was a silent exchange between two men who understood the weight of uniformed service. Jack's trained eyes swept across the area again. It wasn't paranoia, just habit, a habit born of long nights and tense patrols in hostile territory. He noted the placement of the security cameras on the gas station's awning, the reflection of headlights from the highway in the distance, and the faint sound of an approaching engine. It was subtle at first, a distant growl barely distinguishable from the hum of cicadas, but it grew louder with each passing second. 3 motorcycles roared into the lot, their engines cutting through the tranquil evening like thunder. Jack straightened instinctively, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert. The bikes, sleek and well-worn, rolled to a stop near the entrance of the convenience store. Their riders, dressed in leather vests adorned with patches and insignias, dismounted with practiced ease. The largest of the 3, a man with a scraggly gray beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, looked around with an air of dominance. Jack's gaze lingered on the patch sewn onto the man's vest, Steel Reapers NC. His jaw tightened briefly before he forced himself to look away. The other two bikers, one bald and the other wearing a tattered bandana, leaned casually against their bikes, their laughter carrying a sharp edge as they exchanged crude remarks. The largest one, likely their leader, adjusted his vest and began walking toward the store, his boots echoing against the concrete. The peace of the evening fractured subtly, like the faint crack of ice before it gives way. Jack's muscles remained relaxed, but his mind had already started calculating. He glanced toward the clerk, who had retreated inside the store. The bell jingled again as the door swung shut behind the bikers, and Jack's peripheral vision caught their leader looking back briefly, locking eyes with him for a moment longer than necessary. Jack exhaled slowly, turning back to his truck as the gas pump clicked a signal of full tank. He replaced the nozzle with deliberate calm and tightened the cap on the tank. Trouble wasn't inevitable, but it had a way of finding him, and tonight, he could feel its weight hanging in the humid air like a storm waiting to break. The growl of the motorcycles reverberated through the still evening air as the three riders rolled into the gas station lot. Their engines rumbled with an assertive roar, the sound bouncing off the building's concrete walls and filling the otherwise quiet surroundings with an air of dominance. The lead rider, a hulking figure with a scraggly gray beard and broad shoulders, pulled his bike to a halt with practiced ease, his boots skidding against the asphalt as he steadied the machine. His leather vest, adorned with patches and insignias, caught the glow of the overhead lights. One patch stood out in particular, Steel Reapers NC. Behind him, the second rider, a bald man with a stocky build, parked his bike slightly askew, his mouth twisted into a smirk as he surveyed the lot. His leather gloves squeaked faintly as he tightened his grip on the handlebars before dismounting. The third rider, a wiry figure with a tattered bandana covering his head, dismounted last. He leaned against his bike, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans, his posture casual but his eyes scanning the area with a sharpness that belied his relaxed demeanor. Jack Mercer had finished replacing the gas nozzle and tightening the fuel cap on his truck, but he didn't move to leave. His instincts told him to remain aware, to observe without appearing overly interested. From the corner of his eye, he noted the way the lead biker's gaze swept across the lot, lingering on Jack for a moment before shifting to the gas station entrance. The man's stare held a mixture of curiosity and something darker, an unspoken challenge that hung in the humid air. The leader motioned to the others with a jerk of his head, and they followed him toward the convenience store. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, their heavy boots echoing against the tiled floor. Jack watched as the leader's hand brushed against the doorframe, leaving a faint smudge of oil and grime. The gesture seemed almost deliberate, a subtle act of claiming space. Inside the store, the bikers wasted no time making their presence known. The bald one sauntered over to the coffee machine, inspecting the row of disposable cups with exaggerated disdain before selecting one. He filled it halfway, only to spill some onto the floor with an indifferent shrug. "Oops," he muttered, loud enough for the elderly clerk, Frank Harris, to hear. Frank, standing behind the counter, tensed visibly but said nothing, his hands gripping the edge of the counter tightly. The leader, who Jack mentally labeled as Graybeard, approached a rack of potato chips and began pulling bags off one by one, tossing them haphazardly onto the floor. "This place could use a little cleaning up," he said with a sneer, his gravelly voice carrying an edge of mockery. The wiry one with the bandana laughed, a high-pitched sound that grated on the ears, and joined Graybeard in his destructive antics. Jack's jaw tightened as he observed the scene through the gas station's glass windows. Every instinct in his body told him to intervene, but his mind counseled restraint. He knew better than to act impulsively, especially in a situation where the odds were unclear. Instead, He stepped away from his truck and moved casually toward the entrance, as though he had simply decided to grab a drink before leaving. The bell jingled again as Jack entered the store. The air inside was cooler, a welcome contrast to the sticky heat outside. But the tension was palpable. Graybeard glanced up as Jack walked in, his eyes narrowing slightly. The other two bikers paused as well, their postures shifting subtly as they registered his presence. Jack ignored them for the moment, heading straight to the refrigerated section where rows of bottled water and sodas were lined up in neat rows. As Jack reached for a bottle of water, Graybeard's voice cut through the air. Well, looks like we've got company," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "Didn't think anyone else would be brave enough to step in here with the big bad Steel Reapers around." Jack turned slowly, meeting Graybeard's gaze with a steady calm that seemed to unnerve the man for a split second before he recovered. "Just grabbing a drink," Jack said evenly, his voice measured and devoid of emotion. He made no effort to engage further, instead moving toward the counter where Frank stood, his face pale but resolute. The bikers weren't finished. The bald one, Spike, Jack heard Graybeard call him, stepped forward, blocking Jack's path. "What's the rush, soldier boy?" Spike sneered, glancing at Jack's uniform. "We're just trying to have a little fun here. You don't mind, do you?" Jack's eyes flicked briefly to the patches on Spike's vest before returning to his face. "Not at all," he replied coolly, stepping around Spike with calculated precision. He placed the water bottle on the counter, and Frank fumbled slightly as he rang it up. Graybeard wasn't letting it go. "You know, I always wondered what makes you military types think you're better than everyone else," he said, taking a slow step toward Jack. "Walking around in those fancy uniforms, expecting people to bow down and thank you. Must feel pretty special." "Huh?" Jack remained silent, his expression unreadable. He handed Frank a few bills and nodded his thanks, then turned to leave. But as he reached the door, Graybeard's voice stopped him again. "Hey, soldier boy." Jack paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Graybeard smirked, holding up a small American flag patch that he had apparently snatched from one of the shelves. "What's this worth to you? Think it'll protect you if things get rough?" The challenge was unmistakable, and Jack felt a flicker of heat rise in his chest. But he kept his voice calm as he replied, "Respect's not something you can buy or take. It's something you earn." Graybeard's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked it with a scoff. "We'll see about that," he muttered, tossing the patch onto the floor with a deliberate sneer. Jack stepped outside, the bell jingling faintly behind him. As he walked back to his truck, he could feel their eyes on him, their presence like a storm cloud looming on the horizon. He knew this wasn't over. But for now, he focused on the road ahead, his mind already preparing for what might come next. The air in the gas station felt heavier now, as if the rising tension had soaked into the walls. Jack Mercer remained still, his bottle of water clutched loosely in one hand as the three bikers encircled him. The leader, Graybeard, towered just a few feet away, his eyes glinting with smug amusement. The other two, Spike and Razor, positioned themselves on either side of Jack, their postures casual but their intent clear. Graybeard smirked, the fluorescent lights overhead reflecting off the beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "So, soldier boy," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's it like? Huh? Getting paid to play hero? Or maybe just to waste our tax dollars?" He snorted, as if he'd made some profound point. Spike and Razor chuckled, their laughter sharp and grating. Jack's jaw tightened. but he forced his expression to remain neutral. He'd faced far worse threats in his time. But there was something particularly irksome about these men, their brazen arrogance, their misplaced sense of dominance. His eyes flicked briefly to the door, calculating the distance should he need to move quickly. The weight of his training pressed against the back of his mind, urging him to act with precision, not emotion. Spike leaned forward, his bald head gleaming under the harsh lights. "What's the matter? Hero? Cat got your tongue? Thought you army types were all about standing tall and proud. Where's the bravado?" He grinned, his teeth yellowed and uneven. Jack exhaled slowly through his nose, maintaining his silence. He knew better than to rise to their bait. Conflict was inevitable at this point, but he wouldn't be the one to start it. His gaze shifted momentarily to the clerk, Frank Harris, who stood rigid behind the counter. Frank's hands were planted firmly on the countertop, his knuckles white from the tension. The older man's lips were pressed into a thin line, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition, a silent understanding of Jack's current predicament. Razor, the wiry one with the bandana, took a step closer, idly tapping his fingers against his thigh. "You're awful quiet for someone who's supposed to be a tough guy," he sneered. "Maybe we should loosen you up a bit. What do you think, Spike?" Spike grinned, cracking his knuckles. "Oh, I've got a few ideas." Graybeard raised a hand, silencing them with a casual gesture. "Easy now, boys," he said, his voice carrying a mockery of restraint. "Let's not scare our friend here. He's probably had a long day." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. Graybeard took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between himself and Jack. He reached out, his fingers brushing the patch on Jack's uniform, the American flag, stitched neatly onto his chest. His lips curled into a cruel smile. "This," he said, tugging at the patch lightly. "This is supposed to mean something, isn't it? What's it worth to you, soldier boy?" Jack's muscles tensed, a reflexive response that he quickly tempered. His eyes locked onto Graybeard's, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. "Let go," Jack said, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a request. Graybeard chuckled, unfazed. He gave the patch another small tug, testing Jack's patience. "Oh, come on. Don't be like that. We're just having a little fun. Isn't that right, boys?" The other two laughed again, the sound grating against Jack's nerves. Razor added, "Yeah, we're just having some fun. You're not gonna ruin the party, are you?" Frank cleared his throat from behind the counter, drawing the attention of the group. "You fellas might want to think twice about what you're doing," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet warning. "Man like him, you've got no idea what you're messing with." Spike turned his head toward Frank, his grin widening. "Oh, yeah? And what's he gonna do? Call in the cavalry? We're shaking in our boots." Frank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he locked eyes with Jack, offering a subtle nod of reassurance. Jack didn't need the validation, but he appreciated it nonetheless. It was clear that Frank understood exactly who he was dealing with, and, more importantly, what Jack was capable of. Graybeard ignored the exchange, his attention fixed solely on Jack. "You know," he said, his voice softening to a mockery of sincerity, "people like you walk around thinking you're untouchable. But out here, it's a different story. Out here, you're just another guy who's in the wrong place at the wrong time." Jack didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink. "You've made your point," he said evenly. "Now back off." Graybeard's smile widened. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of uncertainty, buried beneath layers of bravado. He gave the patch one final tug before releasing it, letting his hand fall to his side. "Sure thing, hero," he said, taking a step back. "We wouldn't want to ruin your evening." Spike and Razor exchanged glances, their smirks faltering ever so slightly. Jack didn't move, his posture remaining steady and composed. He waited, watching as the bikers began to shift their attention elsewhere, though their mocking laughter continued to fill the air. But Jack knew better than to assume it was over. Trouble had a way of lingering, like the oppressive heat that clung to the night. He could feel it simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest provocation to erupt. And though he remained outwardly calm, his mind was already calculating his next move, preparing for the moment when restraint would no longer be enough. Graybeard's smirk lingered as he stepped back, his boots scraping against the tiled floor. The air remained thick with unspoken tension, a charged atmosphere that seemed to pull everyone into its orbit. Jack Mercer stood his ground, his gaze unwavering as he watched the bikers regroup, their mockery now accompanied by the faintest trace of unease. "You're one cool customer. I'll give you that," Razor said, leaning casually against a nearby display of snack bags. His voice carried a sharp edge, but his eyes darted between Graybeard and Jack, searching for cues on how far they could push. "Yeah, maybe too cool," Spike added, cracking his knuckles with deliberate exaggeration. "I'm starting to think he's hiding something. What do you think, Bear?" Graybeard's expression darkened at the question, and his tone took on a more menacing quality. "I think he's the kind of guy who likes to pretend he's better than everyone else, walking around in that uniform, thinking it gives him a free pass." He took another step forward, closing the space between them again. "You think that patch makes you special? Makes people owe you something?" Jack's breathing remained steady, but his posture shifted slightly. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a minor adjustment, but Frank Harris noticed. The older clerk, still standing behind the counter, his hand resting discreetly near the phone, recognized the subtle shift in Jack's stance. It was the stance of a man who was no longer merely enduring a situation but preparing for it. "Bear, come on," Razor said with a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe he's just shy. Not everyone likes to talk, you know?" "Shut up, Razor," Graybeard snapped, his voice cutting through the thin veneer of camaraderie. He pointed a finger at Jack, his movements deliberate and slow. "You've got one last chance. Soldier boy. Tell me what you think makes you so damn important." Jack's voice was calm, controlled, and laced with quiet authority. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said evenly. "And I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing. Walk away. Now." For a moment, the room was silent. Even the faint hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade into the background. Graybeard stared at Jack, his smirk faltering for the first time. The confidence that had radiated from him moments ago seemed to waver under the weight of Jack's steady gaze. But pride, and the need to save face in front of his crew, pushed him forward. "You're nothing without that uniform," Graybeard said, leaning in so close that Jack could feel the stale scent of his breath. "You're just a guy hiding behind a flag, hoping people don't see what's underneath." Jack's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a low, measured tone. "Last warning. Walk away." Frank held his breath, his fingers twitching near the phone. The bikers seemed to sense the shift in the air, the invisible line that Graybeard was dangerously close to crossing. Spike took a small step back, his earlier bravado waning. But Razor stayed in place, his nervous energy barely contained. Graybeard chuckled, though the sound lacked its earlier confidence. "Big talk for a guy outnumbered 3-1, he said. Straightening up. He glanced over his shoulder at his crew, gesturing for them to back him up. "What do you say, boys? Think we should teach him a little lesson in respect?" Spike hesitated, his gaze flickering to Jack's calm but resolute demeanor. Razor, however, nodded eagerly, eager to prove himself. "Yeah. Let's show him what happens when you mess with the Steel Reapers." Frank finally spoke up, his voice steady but firm. "You three have no idea what you're getting yourselves into," he said, addressing the bikers directly. "I'd think real hard before you make another move." Graybeard turned to glare at Frank, his expression twisting into one of irritation. "Mind your business, old man," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." "It does if you keep tearing out my store." Frank shot back, his hand now fully resting on the phone. "And it definitely does if you think you're gonna start something you can't finish." The remark only seemed to inflame Graybeard further. He turned back to Jack, his face contorted with anger. "You've got a lot of people willing to stick up for you." "Huh. Must be nice," he sneered. "But let's see how tough you really are when it's just you and us." Jack's reply was as calm and unshakable as ever. "I told you to walk away. This is your last chance." Graybeard leaned in again, his voice dripping with venom. "Or what?" he taunted. "What's your uniform worth now, soldier boy?" The room seemed to hold its breath, the moment teetering on the edge of action. Jack's expression remained impassive, but the air around him crackled with a quiet intensity. Frank, Spike, and Razor could all feel it, the sense that the storm was about to break. And when it did, none of them would be ready for what Jack Mercer had in store. Bear's fingers clamped onto Jack's American flag patch, tugging it with a deliberate roughness that sent an undeniable message. The laughter from Spike and Razor echoed around the small convenience store, their jeers punctuating the tension. But Bear's smirk was the sharpest dagger in the room. "What's this worth to you, soldier boy?" Bear growled, his tone low and venomous. He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of stale cigarettes and cheap liquor. "Bet it doesn't mean much to the guys who didn't make it back." "Huh." Jack's entire body stilled. The mocking voices of the bikers faded into the background, muffled by the singular focus of his thoughts. For a moment, he didn't see the store, the bikers, or even Bear's sneering face. Instead, flashes of a dusty, sun-scorched battlefield filled his vision. Fallen comrades, muffled radio chatter, the deafening silence after chaos. His gaze sharpened, locking onto Bear with an intensity that made the larger man pause, even if only briefly. Jack's voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the laughter like a blade. "Let go." Bear's smirk returned, though it faltered slightly at the edges. "Or what?" he taunted, pulling the patch harder, as though testing its strength. His companions chuckled nervously, their bravado wavering under the weight of Jack's presence. Even Frank, standing tensely behind the counter, felt the shift. The air in the store had changed, charged with an electricity that threatened to explode. Jack straightened, his movements deliberate, calculated. He stepped closer to Bear, closing the gap until their faces were only inches apart. "This is your last warning," Jack said, his voice a low growl that sent shivers through everyone within earshot. "Walk away now, and no one gets hurt." For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Bear threw his head back and laughed, a deep, guttural sound that bounced off the walls. "Listen to this guy," he said, turning to Spike and Razor. Thinks he can scare us with that tough guy routine. You're outnumbered. Soldier boy. We own this place now. Spike stepped forward, cracking his knuckles loudly. Yeah. Maybe we'll teach you what happens when you mess with the Steel Reapers, he said. His grin twisted with malicious glee. Razor followed, pulling a battered knife from his pocket and flipping it open with a flourish. Frank's fingers hovered over the phone, but he didn't dial. Something in Jack's stance told him to wait. The younger man's body was coiled, his every movement deliberate and restrained, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Bear's sneer widened as he watched Jack. You think you're tough? You're nothing without that uniform. Just a coward hiding behind a flag. He tugged at the patch again, hard enough that the fabric strained under his grip. That was the breaking point. Jack moved faster than any of them could process. His left hand shot up, gripping Bear's wrist with a force that made the larger man's grin vanish instantly. In the same motion, Jack twisted sharply, pulling Bear's arm into a painful lock that forced him to release the patch. The biker let out a guttural yell. But before he could react further, Jack stepped forward and used his momentum to push Bear off balance. The larger man stumbled back, colliding with a display of canned goods that clattered to the floor. Spike's grin disappeared as he lunged forward, raising a fist to strike. Jack pivoted smoothly, sidestepping the attack and grabbing Spike's arm mid-swing. Using Spike's own momentum against him, Jack twisted the arm and delivered a controlled strike to his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground with a pained grunt. The impact was loud, but Jack's movements remained eerily quiet, efficient, and precise. Razor hesitated for a split second, his confidence faltering as he watched his companions fall. But the blade in his hand glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, and he steeled himself. He lunged, the knife aimed directly at Jack's midsection. Frank gasped audibly, his hand gripping the phone tightly now. Jack's reaction was instantaneous. He sidestepped the attack, his hand shooting out to grab Razor's wrist. With a sharp twist, he disarmed the biker, the knife clattering harmlessly to the floor. Before Razor could recover, Jack swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing onto his back. The impact knocked the wind out of Razor, leaving him gasping and disoriented. In the span of mere seconds, the fight was over. Jack stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing steady, his posture calm. Around him, the three bikers groaned on the floor, their earlier bravado reduced to pained gasps and muffled curses. The store was silent again, save for the faint hum of the refrigerators and the sound of Frank's heavy breathing behind the counter. Jack's gaze swept the room, assessing the situation with the precision of a soldier scanning a battlefield. His expression remained neutral, though his eyes held a flicker of something deeper, not anger, but a quiet resolve. He crouched down briefly, picking up the discarded flag patch and smoothing it out before tucking it back into place on his uniform. Frank finally exhaled, his grip on the phone loosening. He'd seen a lot in his time, more than he cared to remember, but nothing quite like what he'd just witnessed. Jack's movements had been flawless, every action calculated to neutralize without unnecessary harm. Frank's mind raced back to his own days in Vietnam, to the drills and missions that had demanded the same level of precision. He couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. They didn't stand a chance. Frank murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible over the groans of the defeated bikers. Jack didn't respond. His focus remained on the three men at his feet, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the chaos he'd just unraveled. And then, with deliberate steps, Jack turned to the counter, placing a few bills on the surface. "For the water," he said simply, his tone even. Frank nodded mutely, watching as Jack made his way to the door. The bell jingled faintly as it swung shut behind him, leaving Frank to process the whirlwind that had just unfolded. Jack stood in the center of the wreckage, his steady breathing the only sound cutting through the stillness. The chaos he had orchestrated in mere seconds was a stark contrast to the calm resolve he now projected. Around him, the three bikers lay in various states of defeat. Razor, clutching his ribs, was still gasping for air on the floor. Spike groaned as he tried to roll over, his shoulder visibly out of alignment. Bear, the self-appointed leader, was slumped against the collapsed display of canned goods, his face twisted in equal parts pain and disbelief. Frank Harris's eyes darted between the fallen bikers and Jack. His fingers still hovered over the phone, though the instinct to call for help had faded. He'd been a witness to something extraordinary. Jack's actions weren't just those of a man defending himself, they were the calculated movements of someone who had spent years mastering control in the face of chaos. Frank's mind drifted to his days in Vietnam. He'd known men like Jack before, soldiers who didn't need to posture or boast because their skill spoke volumes. Watching Jack dismantle the three bikers had brought it all rushing back: the drills, the precision, the unspoken understanding of what it meant to act decisively. Frank's grip on the counter tightened as he murmured to himself. He didn't waste a single move. Bear groaned loudly, shifting slightly as he tried to push himself up. His hands trembled against the tile, the bravado that had once fueled his taunts now entirely absent. He looked up at Jack, his lips curling into a weak snarl. You think you're better than us?" he spat, though his voice lacked the force it had carried earlier. "You're just some punk in a uniform." Jack stepped closer, his boots echoing ominously on the tile floor. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to Bear's level, and locked eyes with him. The room seemed to hold its breath as Jack spoke, his voice calm but filled with unmistakable authority. "No," he said simply, "but I'm someone who knows when to stop. You should learn that lesson." Bear's glare faltered, and he looked away, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own defeat. Jack straightened and turned his attention to Spike and Razor, both of whom had managed to sit upright but made no effort to rise further. Spike winced as he cradled his dislocated shoulder, his earlier bravado reduced to silence. Razor's eyes darted nervously, the adrenaline that had fueled his aggression now replaced by fear. Frank finally found his voice, his tone sharp and laced with incredulity. "You boys picked the wrong guy to mess with," he said, stepping out from behind the counter. He gestured toward the door with a jerking motion. "Get out of my store before I change my mind about calling the cops." Bear, still slumped on the floor, grumbled something incoherent as he tried to pull himself up. Jack moved forward and extended a hand, not to help but to emphasize his next words. "You walk out of here, and this ends," Jack said evenly. "But if I see any of you again, it won't go this way next time." The weight of his statement hung in the air. Bear glared at him but said nothing, instead using a nearby shelf to steady himself as he rose shakily to his feet. Razor followed, still clutching his side, and Spike stumbled after them, his face pale and twisted with pain. None of them dared to look back as they shuffled toward the exit, their earlier dominance shattered. The bell jingled faintly as the door swung shut behind them. Jack watched through the glass as they climbed onto their bikes, their movements slow and labored. The roar of the engines lacked its earlier aggression as the bikers pulled away, disappearing into the night. The sound of their departure lingered for a moment before fading entirely, leaving the store in an almost eerie quiet. Frank let out a long breath and leaned heavily against the counter. "I've been running this place for 30 years, he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Never seen anything like that before." Jack turned to him, his expression softening slightly. Didn't want it to come to that, he said. But sometimes people don't give you a choice. Frank nodded, his gaze drifting to the mess of knocked-over shelves and spilled merchandise. They had it coming. That's for sure, he said. But the way you handled them, that's not something you learn in a bar fight. Jack offered a faint smile but didn't elaborate. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, placing them on the counter. For the water, he said simply. Frank waved the money away. After what you just did. This one's on the house, he said firmly. Hell. Coffee's free for you anytime you're passing through. Jack nodded in gratitude but didn't linger. He turned and headed toward the door, his movements unhurried but purposeful. The bell jingled once more as he stepped out into the humid night air. The world outside felt oddly still, as though the tension from earlier had evaporated entirely. Frank watched him go, his thoughts racing. He thought about the precision of Jack's movements, the way he'd handled himself with such control and efficiency. It reminded Frank of his own time in Vietnam, of the men he'd served with who had carried themselves the same way. Soldiers who didn't fight because they wanted to, but because they had to. As Jack's truck pulled away, its taillights fading into the distance, Frank found himself murmuring softly to no one in particular. They didn't stand a chance. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The distant wail of sirens cut through the quiet night, growing louder with each passing second. Jack Mercer leaned against his truck, his calm demeanor unshaken as the blue and red lights flashed across the parking lot. He watched the squad cars pull up, their tires crunching over the gravel. Two officers stepped out, their movements swift and purposeful. Leading them was a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, Officer Maria Torres. Torres took one look at the scene, the disheveled bikers nursing their injuries, the toppled shelves and scattered merchandise inside the gas station, and Jack standing off to the side, his uniform neat and untouched. Her brow furrowed as she approached Frank, who had stepped outside to greet them, still wiping his hands nervously on a rag. Evening, Frank, Torres said, her tone brisk but not unkind. You call this in? Frank nodded quickly. Yeah. Had no choice. These fellas, he gestured toward the bikers, who were now attempting to straighten themselves out under the scrutiny of the officers, came in, started causing trouble. But let me tell you, they messed with the wrong guy tonight. Torres's eyes shifted to Jack. She sized him up in an instant, her gaze lingering on the patches on his uniform. Special Forces, she asked, her voice betraying a note of respect. Jack gave her a small nod. That's right. Before Torres could ask more, Bear stumbled forward, his face contorted in a mix of pain and indignation. Officer, I want to press charges, he declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Jack. This guy attacked us for no reason. We were just minding our own business, and he lost it. Spike, still cradling his dislocated shoulder, chimed in. Yeah. We didn't do nothing. He blindsided us. Razor, leaning heavily against one of the bikes, nodded vigorously. We were just grabbing coffee. Next thing we know, this lunatic's throwing punches like some action hero. Torres raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. She glanced back at Jack, who remained silent, his face impassive. Then she turned to Frank. What's your take? Frank? Frank let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. You believe that story, Maria? I've got security cameras in there that'll show you everything. These three came in looking for trouble, and they got it. Jack here only acted when they left him no choice. Torres nodded and motioned for one of the junior officers to check the footage. Meanwhile, she turned her attention back to the bikers. "Why don't you tell me what really happened?" she said, her tone laced with quiet authority. Bear scowled, his bravado faltering under Torres's gaze. "I already told you. We were just talking." And he flipped out. "Talking?" Torres repeated, her skepticism evident. "Because from what I'm seeing, it doesn't look like a friendly conversation." Spike shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a misunderstanding," he mumbled. "No big deal." "No big deal?" Torres repeated, glancing pointedly at the knife lying on the ground near Razor. Her expression hardened. So whose bright idea was it to pull a weapon during this misunderstanding? Razor opened his mouth to speak but quickly closed it again, his face flushing red. Frank let out a quiet chuckle from where he stood, clearly enjoying the biker's discomfort. The junior officer returned, holding a tablet that displayed the security footage. Torres watched intently as the events played out, the bikers' taunts, the escalating aggression, and Jack's calm restraint until the moment Bear grabbed his flag patch. The brief but decisive altercation that followed left no doubt about who had instigated the conflict. Torres sighed and handed the tablet back to her colleague. She turned to the bikers, her expression icy. "You want to explain why you thought it was a good idea to assault a Special Forces soldier?" she asked, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. Bear's face turned red, and he sputtered. He didn't. I mean, we didn't know." "Didn't know?" Torres snapped, stepping closer. "You didn't know? So you figured you'd just push your luck and see what happens?" Spike attempted to chime in again, but Torres silenced him with a raised hand. "Enough. You three are done. You're under arrest for assault, attempted assault with a weapon, and whatever else we find when we run your records." She motioned for the other officers to cuff them, ignoring their protests and sputtering excuses. As the bikers were led to the squad cars, Razor muttered under his breath, "This is bull, we didn't even." "Save it," Torres snapped, cutting him off. "You'll have plenty of time to explain it to a judge." With the bikers secured, Torres turned her attention back to Jack. Her sharp gaze softened slightly as she approached him. "You handled that well," she said, her tone genuine. "Most people wouldn't have kept their cool in a situation like that." "Wasn't much of a choice," Jack replied simply. "They weren't going to stop until someone made them." Torres nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Still, you kept it clean. Minimal force. No unnecessary harm. That's not something we see every day." Jack gave a small shrug. "Training comes in handy." Frank stepped forward, his voice carrying a mix of humor and admiration. "Training? Hell, Maria. That wasn't just training. That was a masterclass. Those idiots never stood a chance." Torres chuckled, glancing back at the squad cars where the bikers sat sulking. "No, they didn't," she agreed. Then, turning back to Jack, she added, "But seriously, picking a fight with a Special Forces soldier? What were they thinking?" Jack didn't respond immediately. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, his eyes briefly meeting Torres's. "Some lessons are learned the hard way," he said quietly. Torres nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Let's hope they've learned something tonight." She extended a hand toward Jack. "Safe travels, Sergeant. And thank you." Jack shook her hand firmly. "Thank you, Officer Torres." As the police cars pulled away, their flashing lights receding into the distance, Frank let out a long breath. He turned to Jack. shaking his head with a wry smile. "You've got one hell of a way of handling trouble. You know that?" Jack gave a faint chuckle, his demeanor as calm as ever. "Just doing what needed to be done." The faint sound of gravel crunching beneath his truck's tires filled the quiet evening air as Jack Mercer pulled into his driveway. The glow of the porch light illuminated the familiar contours of his small home. A sanctuary he'd thought about every single day during his deployment. The house seemed to radiate warmth, a stark contrast to the harsh, fluorescent-lit chaos of the gas station hours earlier. Jack shut off the engine and sat in the cab for a moment, breathing in the stillness before stepping out. He could see movement through the living room window. The silhouette of his wife, Karen, pacing as if she'd been waiting for his arrival. She hadn't known the exact time he'd be home. He'd wanted it to be a surprise. The door opened just as he reached the first step of the porch. Karen stood there, framed by the light spilling from inside. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her eyes, already glistening with unshed tears, widened as she took in the sight of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with emotion, until Karen broke it with a soft, choked whisper. "Jack? I'm home," he said simply, his voice steady but laced with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Karen moved before he could say anything else, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, and she buried her face against his shoulder. Jack held her close, feeling the familiar weight of her presence, her warmth grounding him after everything he'd faced. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment, the sensation of being back where he belonged. "You didn't tell me you were coming tonight," Karen said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Wanted to surprise you," he replied, brushing a hand over her back. "Didn't want you worrying about timing." Before she could respond, a small voice called out from inside the house. "Daddy?" Jack's chest tightened as he looked up to see his 6-year-old daughter, Ella, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Her dark hair framed her round face, and her wide eyes were filled with cautious hope, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Hey, pumpkin," Jack said, his voice softening even more. He crouched down, opening his arms. Ella didn't hesitate. She bolted toward him, her small feet pounding against the wooden porch as she launched herself into his arms. Jack caught her easily, lifting her off the ground as she clung to him tightly. "You're back," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against his chest. "I'm back," Jack confirmed, his throat tightening. He held her close, her tiny frame fitting perfectly in his arms. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet joy of this reunion. Ella pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining with excitement. She reached out and touched the flag patch on his uniform, her small fingers tracing its edges. "You still have this," she said proudly. Jack smiled, his heart swelling. "Of course I do. It's important. Just like you." Karen stepped closer, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. Her gaze moved between him and Ella, her expression softening. "She's been talking about you every day," Karen said quietly, "drawing pictures, telling everyone at school her daddy's a soldier." Ella nodded eagerly. "And I told Mrs. Watson that you're the best soldier ever. She said she'd like to meet you one day." Jack chuckled, a deep, warm sound that felt foreign after the tension of earlier events. "Well, I'd be happy to meet Mrs. Watson. But right now, I'm happy just being here with you too." Karen's hand tightened on his shoulder, and she gave him a knowing smile. "We're happy you're home." Jack. Really home? As they moved inside, the warmth of the house enveloped him. The living room was cozy and familiar, filled with small details that reminded him of what he'd missed: Ella's colorful drawings taped to the fridge, the faint scent of Karen's lavender candles, and the worn armchair he'd claimed as his own years ago. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, fluorescent chaos of the gas station and the calculated violence he'd unleashed there. This was peace, not the uneasy truce of a battlefield, but true, unshakable peace. As Ella chattered excitedly about her latest school project, Jack found himself studying her face, committing every detail to memory. Her innocence, her unshakable belief in him, was a reminder of why he'd endured everything he had. She was his anchor, the reason he could face the chaos and still come home whole. Karen watched him closely, her eyes catching the fleeting shadows that crossed his face when Ella wasn't looking. She knew him well enough to see the contrast between his calm exterior and the weight he carried inside. Later, when Ella was asleep, they would talk. But for now, she let him have this moment, this reprieve. Ella tugged at Jack's hand, pulling him toward the couch. "Come sit. I want to show you something." He let her guide him, sinking into the familiar cushions as she ran to grab a small notebook from the coffee table. She climbed onto his lap, flipping through pages filled with colorful drawings of stick figure soldiers, tanks, and what appeared to be a flag surrounded by stars. She pointed to one drawing in particular, a stick figure in a green uniform standing next to a smaller figure holding hands. "This is you and me," she explained, her finger tracing the image. "I drew it when you were gone so I wouldn't forget what you look like." Jack's breath hitched, and he swallowed hard. "It's perfect." "Pumpkin," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." Karen sat beside them, resting her head on Jack's shoulder as they looked through Ella's drawings together. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt truly at ease. The weight of his training, the memories of the fight, and the tension of the past year all faded into the background, replaced by the simple, undeniable joy of being home. The next morning, Frank Harris stood outside his gas station, carefully securing a new sign to the door. The bold lettering read, "Veterans always welcome, free coffee." He stepped back to admire his work, a small smile tugging at his lips. 4 years. Frank had run the station without much fanfare, but last night had reminded him of the sacrifices men like Jack Mercer made. This was his way of showing gratitude, a gesture he hoped would resonate with others. Inside, the security footage from the previous night had already made its rounds on social media. Clips of Jack's calm demeanor and precise takedown of the bikers had gone viral, garnering thousands of views and comments. The narrative was clear: Jack Mercer, a Special Forces veteran, had protected himself and others with discipline and restraint. Local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing him a hero. It wasn't long before strangers began stopping by the gas station, some just to shake Frank's hand and thank him for putting up the sign. Meanwhile, the Steel Reapers Motorcycle Club convened an emergency meeting. Their clubhouse, dimly lit and filled with the smell of motor oil and stale beer, buzzed with murmured conversations until the club president, a burly man known as Tank, called for order. Tank's voice was firm as he addressed the gathered members. Bear, Spike, Razor, they crossed a line. Disrespecting a soldier, a veteran, is not who we are. They've brought shame to the club. The room murmured in agreement, though a few looked hesitant. Tank continued, his tone leaving no room for debate. By unanimous vote, they're out. Effective immediately. We don't tolerate that kind of behavior. Back at his small apartment, Bear sat alone at his kitchen table, a pen in his hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of him. His arm throbbed from the previous night, a stark reminder of Jack's strength and precision. For the first time in years, Bear felt something unfamiliar: shame. The words didn't come easily, but eventually, he began to write. To Jack Mercer, I'm writing this because I owe you an apology. Not just for what happened, but for the disrespect I showed to you and everything you've done for this country. I thought I was tough until I met you. What you did last night, it wasn't just strength. It was honor. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say this. You've earned my respect. Sincerely, Bear, Stan Tully. Bear folded the letter carefully and sealed it in an envelope, addressing it to Fort Bragg's post office with Jack's name. It wasn't much, but it was a start. At his home, Jack sat on the back porch, the warm glow of the setting sun washing over him. Ella played in the yard, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Karen brought him a cup of coffee, sitting beside him with a quiet smile. Jack's thoughts wandered briefly to the events at the gas station. He felt no anger, no lingering tension, only a quiet sense of pride that he'd handled the situation without letting it consume him. He glanced at Karen and Ella, their presence grounding him. He'd faced chaos and come home intact. And as he sipped his coffee, he allowed himself to hope that the peace he felt now would last, for his family and for himself. Jack's story reminds us that strength isn't about starting fights, it's about knowing when to end them. What's your takeaway from this encounter? Do you agree with how he handled it? Let's hear your perspective. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.